Wife goes to a fertility clinic, but freezes when she sees her husband with his ex-wife who is pregnant, and hears something that shocks her. The silence in the bathroom was heavy, almost solid. Amelia felt the dense air in her lungs, each breath a conscious effort. On the white marble sink, next to the chrome faucet that dripped with an irritating persistence, rested the small white plastic object. The pregnancy test. Another one. The result was as clear and unequivocal as the pain it inflicted. A single solitary line, a red stripe that seemed to mock her. Negative. The word echoed in her mind, a constant ricochet against the walls of her already fragile hope. Negative. Again. For what seemed like the 1,000th time in 5 years of trying, the answer was the same. A categorical no from the universe, a cruel reminder of her inability. She closed her eyes, leaning her hands on the cold surface of the sink, and the image of Arthur appeared in her mind. His smile, always encouraging, but which in recent times seemed to carry a trace of resignation. "Next time, my love, we'll make it," he would say. The words, once a balm, now sounded hollow, a rehearsed script for a drama that seemed endless. Amelia and Arthur were a couple that many considered perfect. They met later in life, both in their 30s, carrying baggage from previous relationships, but with a common desire that bound them like cement, building a family. For Amelia, it was a lifelong dream. She imagined herself with a round belly, feeling the first kicks, choosing names and decorating a nursery in pastel tones. For Arthur, it was a chance to relive fatherhood in a different way. And there lay the most sensitive point of Amelia's wound. Arthur was already a father. Luke, his son with Ava, the ex-wife, was a 16-year-old teenager, intelligent and surprisingly mature. Amelia loved him as if he were her own, and the boy treated her with genuine affection and respect. But Luke's existence was a living, walking proof that the problem wasn't with Arthur. The failure, the defect, the piece that didn't fit in the puzzle of life was her. At least, that's how she felt, a conviction that solidified with every menstrual cycle, every negative test. Ava, the ex. A woman who, even absent from the couple's daily life, cast a long and inescapable shadow. There was no animosity between them. On the contrary, the relationship was civilized, almost cordial, because of Luke. But for Amelia, Ava represented success where she only found failure. Ava had given Arthur a child, a lineage, a continuity, and she, Amelia, couldn't. The insistent drip of the faucet seemed to mark time, each plop a second less of her youth, her fertility. She grabbed the test and, with a quick and angry motion, threw it into the small trash bin next to the toilet. The sound of the plastic hitting the bottom of the basket was unsatisfyingly quiet. She wanted to break something, scream, vent the frustration that consumed her from within, turning her empty womb into a knot of anguish. She remembered the last family dinner at her parents' house. Her mother, with the tact of an elephant in a china shop, asked in front of everyone, "So, my daughter, any news to share with us?" Amelia's forced smile hurt her face, while Arthur, noticing her discomfort, quickly changed the subject, talking about a promotion at work. He always protected her, but that protection, no matter how well-intentioned, only underlined the truth. There was something to be protected from, a failure, a shame. The dream of being a mother had turned into an obsession that colored every aspect of her life. Conversations with friends who talked about their little kids' antics were torture. Strolling in the park and seeing couples pushing strollers was like a stab in the chest. Social media had become a minefield of pregnancy announcements and newborn photos. The world seemed to conspire to remind her of what she couldn't have. And the worst was the silence that settled between her and Arthur. Intimacy, once a celebration of their love, became mechanical, scheduled, a means to an end that never came. Sex had lost its spontaneity, replaced by ovulation charts, basal temperature thermometers, and palpable anxiety. They made love not out of desire, but out of duty, a duty to the dream that each day seemed more distant. Arthur tried. God, how he tried. He suggested trips to relax, romantic dinners to forget about it, but the issue was always there, an unwanted third guest at the table. "Amelia, we already have a family. Me, you, and Luke," he said one night, while she cried quietly in bed after another disappointment. "If it doesn't happen, it won't change how I feel about you." She knew he was sincere, but his words didn't console her. Because it wasn't just about having a child with him, it was about her own body, her own identity as a woman. It was about filling a void that became more cavernous with each passing year. That morning, after throwing the test in the trash, Amelia looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the fine lines of worry forming around her eyes, the shadow of exhaustion that makeup could no longer hide. She was 35. The biological clock wasn't just ticking, it sounded like a fire alarm in her head. The faucet drip finally stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive. It was in that silence that an idea, a thought she had been repressing, began to take shape. She had heard about fertility clinics, treatments that were almost miraculous. Arthur was skeptical. "It's a lot of money, a lot of emotional stress, my love. What if it doesn't work?" he argued. He was afraid of seeing her suffer even more. But the suffering was already her daily companion. What more did she have to lose? A cold determination began to replace the pain. If the universe wouldn't give her what she wanted, she would force it. If destiny closed the doors on her, she would find a window. She could no longer rely on luck, nature, or words of consolation. She needed science, experts, a solution. And in that moment, looking at her own desolate reflection in the bathroom mirror, Amelia made a decision. A decision that would change everything. She would seek professional help. But she would do it alone, search for references, recommendations. She wouldn't tell Arthur. Not yet. She didn't want to burden him with another hope that might shatter. This would be her secret journey, her last and solitary bet against fate. She had no idea, however, that the path she was about to take would lead her to a truth much more shocking and painful than any negative test. The secret she planned to keep was just a small shadow compared to the abyss that was about to open beneath her feet. Amelia spent the following days immersed in discreet research, taking advantage of the moments when Arthur was at work. The name of the clinic came up in a whispered conversation with an old college friend, Emily, during a coffee meetup. Emily, who now had twins running around the house, confessed that they were the result of a little push from science. "It's in Chicago, Amy, called New Horizons. Not cheap, but they're the best. They made the impossible happen for me," Emily said, with a glow in her eyes that Amelia coveted with all her might. New Horizons. The name sounded like a promise, a fresh start. Scheduling the appointment was an act of silent rebellion. She used her own credit card, money she had been saving for an eventual kitchen remodel. She invented an excuse for Arthur about an all-day interior design workshop in the city, a lie that weighed on her tongue, but one she swallowed along with her guilt. It was for a greater good, she convinced herself. It was to protect his heart and hers from another premature disappointment. The drive to Chicago was a blur of highway and anxiety. Each mile conquered increased the mix of dread and hope within her. The clinic building was imposing, with a mirrored glass facade reflecting the grey sky of the city. It looked more like an investment bank than a place where dreams were conceived in a lab. Inside, the environment was one of aseptic calm, neutral tones, minimalist furniture, and a reverent silence, broken only by the soft sound of a water fountain in a corner. Everyone in the waiting lobby shared the same look, a mix of vulnerability and determination. Amelia felt for the first time in a long time understood without a single word being spoken. The consultation with Dr. Anderson was long and detailed. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a way of speaking that conveyed confidence. He listened to her patiently, analyzed her old exams, and explained the possibilities with a realism that, paradoxically, filled her with hope. He didn't promise miracles, but offered a path, a plan, a series of logical steps. For the first time, her frustrated dream was treated not as a personal failure, but as a medical condition with possible solutions. Amelia left the office feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders and replaced by an action plan. The first step would be a new battery of more specific exams to outline a precise diagnosis. She already had the follow-up scheduled. She walked toward the exit, her mind buzzing with possibilities, a discreet smile finally finding space on her lips. She crossed the hallway and entered the main lobby again, the same one that had welcomed her hours before. That's when her world stopped spinning. He was there. On the other side of the spacious lobby, near a large vase with a white orchid, stood Arthur, her husband. The initial shock was like a punch to the stomach, knocking the air out of her. What was he doing there? Had he discovered her lie? Had he followed her? Panic began to rise in her throat, but it was immediately annihilated by a second sight, one that turned the shock into pure, icy horror. Arthur wasn't alone. Beside him was Ava, and Ava was pregnant. It wasn't a subtle pregnancy early in gestation. It was a prominent, round belly, impossible to mistake for simple weight gain. A belly that announced life unequivocally. Amelia felt the ground disappear. The air in her lungs froze. Instinctively, like a cornered animal, she took a step back, hiding behind a concrete pillar that supported the mezzanine. Her heart pounded wildly against her ribs, a frantic drum amid the deafening silence that had settled in her mind. From there, in her hidden position, she watched the scene that made no sense and, at the same time, seemed to explain everything. Arthur had his hand resting protectively on Ava's back. He spoke to her in a low voice, his head tilted in a gesture of intimacy that Amelia knew so well. Ava, in turn, looked at him with an expression of gratitude, her hand resting on her own belly. The image was devastating. A family portrait. A family she wasn't part of. The clinic, the same clinic. The coincidence was too brutal to be a coincidence. The pain that hit her was different from all the others. It wasn't the melancholic pain of a negative test. It was the sharp, cutting pain of betrayal. Every piece of the puzzle of her life seemed to rearrange into a new image, a monstrous one. Arthur's skepticism about the treatments, his reluctance, his words of consolation, everything gained a new and sinister meaning. He didn't want to try with her because he was already succeeding with another, with the ex-wife. Amelia held her breath, her nails digging into her palm. She needed to get out of there before being seen, but her feet seemed nailed to the floor. She was paralyzed, a spectator to her own ruin, hidden behind a pillar, while her husband and his pregnant ex-wife shared a tender moment in the lobby of a fertility clinic. The same place that minutes before had given her hope, now became the stage for her deepest nightmare. Time seemed to have distorted. It was like watching a silent film, where gestures and expressions told a terrible story she didn't want to understand. Arthur leaned even closer to Ava. The gesture was so intimate, so loaded with complicity, that a new wave of nausea rose in Amelia's throat. He hugged her from the side, a hug that wasn't from a friend but from an accomplice, a protector. And then he whispered something in her ear. Even from a distance, in the quiet acoustics of the lobby, his voice traveled, fragmented but terribly clear. The words reached Amelia's ears like shards of glass. She can't find out. No one can find out. She. The pronoun hit her like a physical blow. She was Amelia, the wife, the fool who was at home, or rather, who he thought was at home, while he lived a double life. The next sentence was the final verdict, the nail that sealed the coffin of her trust. Same time next week, right? Ava, with her hand still resting on the prominent belly, turned her face to him. A slow, almost serene smile lit her lips. She said nothing. She just nodded, a subtle and definitive head movement. Then she caressed her own belly, a universal gesture of motherhood and contentment. That smile, that caress on the belly, was the visual confirmation of what Arthur's words had already etched into her soul. It was their secret, their plan. And she was the person who should be kept in the dark. In that instant, the ground didn't just vanish under Amelia's feet. The entire universe seemed to implode. The pain of infertility, the anguish of negative tests, all of it paled, becoming insignificant in the face of the magnitude of that betrayal. It wasn't just about a child. It was about the lie, about the secret life her husband was building with his ex-wife right under her nose. The hope that Dr. Anderson had given her minutes before crumbled to dust, a cruel joke from fate. Arthur gave Ava's shoulder one last squeeze and stepped away, walking toward the exit opposite the one Amelia needed to take. Ava remained for another moment, the smile still on her lips before turning and walking slowly to the reception. Amelia didn't understand why he left alone and also why he didn't kiss her. There was something strange going on between them too. The spell that held Amelia to the floor finally broke. A self-preservation instinct propelled her. She needed to get out of there. Now, before Ava saw her. With her heart hammering erratically, she moved, keeping the pillar between her and the reception, and practically ran to the glass door. The cold air of the street hit her face, but she barely felt it. She was in a vacuum, deaf and blind to the world around her. She walked mechanically to the parking lot, her mind repeating in an infinite loop Arthur's words. She can't find out. Same time next week, right? Upon reaching her car, she unlocked the doors, got in, and sat, but didn't start the engine. She rested her forehead on the steering wheel, the cold leather against her feverish skin. The tears she had held back so fiercely finally came, not as a cry of sadness, but as dry, ragged sobs of pure rage and desolation. The crying didn't last long. The pain was so deep it seemed beyond tears. When the sobs ceased, a new feeling began to emerge from the ashes of her shock. A coldness, a clarity sharp as a razor. The image of Ava's smile, Arthur's protective hand, burned into her retina. The betrayal was obvious, but the details were a blur. Why? Why there? Why with her? The stunned victim began to give way to an investigator. The pain hadn't disappeared, but now it was coated with a layer of icy determination. She wouldn't confront him. Not yet. A confrontation now would result in more lies, denials, flimsy excuses. He would call her crazy, say she imagined things. No. She needed proof, irrefutable proof. Same time next week, right? The phrase echoed again, but this time not as a sentence, but as a clue. A date, a time, a location. He had unknowingly given her the exact coordinates of their next secret meeting. Amelia straightened in the seat. She grabbed her phone, her hands still trembling slightly. She opened the Notes app. The blank screen seemed to stare at her. With her index finger, she typed, the words becoming a mantra, a plan. Next Wednesday, 3 in the afternoon, New Horizons Clinic. She looked at what she had written. Those few words contained her new purpose. The search for a child had been replaced by the search for the truth, a truth she suspected would destroy her, but one she needed to know. She was no longer the woman who dreamed of a crib. She was the woman planning a stakeout. The plan to build a family was dead. In its place, the plan to unmask them was born. And right there, she tore up the exam requests that Dr. Anderson had given her. The week that followed was the longest of Amelia's life. Each hour dragged with torturous slowness, a thick and heavy time, saturated with dark thoughts and a rage that simmered beneath the surface of her skin. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing daily tasks on autopilot, while her mind worked incessantly, replaying the scene in the clinic lobby. The hug, the whisper, Ava's smile. The betrayal seemed to expand, contaminating everything. How did she not know Ava was pregnant? They weren't friends, but communication existed, always around Luke. And Luke himself, the teenager she had learned to love, why hadn't he mentioned anything? A pregnancy of his own mother wasn't something to comment on. Suddenly, Amelia felt like an outsider in her own life, surrounded by a pact of silence of which she was the only target. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. To avoid Arthur, she faked a bad flu bug. It was the only plausible excuse for her apathetic state and the deep, dark circles that not even makeup could disguise. In the first few days, she took refuge at her parents' house, a sanctuary of normalcy that now seemed to belong to another life. Arthur's calls were constant, his voice laden with a concern that sounded grotesquely false to her ears. "Are you sure you don't want me to come over, my love? I'm worried," he would say. "No need, Art. Mom's taking care of me." "Better you don't come so you don't catch it too," she replied, her voice carefully controlled not to tremble, each word a lie that poisoned her a little more. She listened to him, but the only thing she could think was, she can't find out. When she returned home, the abyss between them was palpable. She dodged his touches, claiming body aches. At night, she turned to the opposite side in bed, pretending heavy sleep, while the rage and pain kept her in a feverish state of wakefulness. He seemed confused, perhaps even hurt by her distance, But he didn't insist, probably attributing it all to the supposed illness. His ignorance was, at the same time, an insult, and the only thing that allowed Amelia to keep her plan secret. Finally, Wednesday arrived. The day of truth. Amelia felt a wave of icy adrenaline course through her body when she woke up. She told Arthur she had a follow-up doctor's appointment, a half-truth that gave her the cover she needed. She left the house much earlier than the time, her heart beating a heavy and steady rhythm against her chest. She didn't go straight to the clinic. She drove to an adjacent street, a spot that gave her a clear view of the New Horizons entrance without drawing attention. She turned off the engine and waited. The car became her trench, a hideout from where she would observe the battlefield. The Notes app with the time notation was open on the passenger seat, a somber reminder of her purpose. Time passed. Each approaching car made her stomach churn. At 2:55 punctually she saw him. Arthur's black sedan, unmistakable. He turned the corner and maneuvered into the clinic parking lot. Amelia shrank in the seat, her body tense as a violin string. He got out of the car. He was dressed casually, but there was a rigidity in his posture. He looked around, as if checking something, and then opened the passenger door. Ava emerged, her pregnant belly even more evident under the knit dress she wore. The scene was exactly as Amelia had predicted, a painful repetition of what she already knew. The familiar rage bubbled back up. But then, something unexpected happened. The back door of Arthur's car opened, and a third man got out. Amelia frowned, leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the figure. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair. She recognized him instantly. It was Thomas, Ava's current husband. The man she had married a few years after divorcing Arthur. Confusion hit Amelia like a wave, sweeping away the icy certainty that had sustained her all week. What was Thomas doing there? The simple and painful narrative she had built in her mind of a secret affair between her husband and the ex suddenly shattered. Thomas's presence didn't fit. Husbands don't usually accompany their wives to meetings with lovers. She watched, paralyzed, as the trio formed on the sidewalk. Arthur said something, and Thomas responded with a nod. There was no tension between the two men. On the contrary, the atmosphere seemed collaborative, of a shared purpose. Ava was between them, and the three walked together side by side toward the glass entrance of the clinic. Amelia's mind spun, desperately trying to process the new information. The rage gave way to a deep disorientation. This wasn't a romantic rendezvous. It wasn't an affair. It was something else. Something more complex, stranger, and perhaps even more disturbing. The image of the three, her husband, his pregnant ex-wife, and her current husband, entering a fertility clinic together, was so bizarre, so surreal, that it defied any logical explanation. The confusion was a dense fog in her head, and the only certainty left was that the secret they guarded was much bigger and more complicated than she could ever have imagined. For a long moment, Amelia remained in the car, the engine off, her brain trying to process the impossible image she had just witnessed. The theory of a secret affair, which had been the source of her agony for an entire week, crumbled in seconds, leaving behind a vacuum of pure and disconcerting confusion. The pain of betrayal didn't disappear, but now it was mixed with a new and overwhelming feeling, the need to understand. The initial plan of just observing and gathering evidence for a future confrontation suddenly seemed inadequate. Staying there, in her trench of metal and glass, wouldn't give her answers. The truth, or at least part of it, was inside, just a few yards away, behind those mirrored glass doors. Driven by a force she didn't know where it came from, a mix of desperation and courage, Amelia made a decision. She would go in. With her heart pounding in her throat, she got out of the car. Her legs felt strange, disconnected from her body, but she forced them to move. She crossed the street, her mind focused on one goal, not to be seen. As she pushed the heavy glass door, the familiar and aseptic environment of the clinic enveloped her again. The same silence, the same calm. But for Amelia, the place was now charged with electric tension. She spotted the receptionist, the same one from the previous week, busy on a call. With her head down, pretending to search for something in her purse, Amelia passed quickly by the desk and headed to a side hallway that led to a smaller secondary waiting room, less crowded. From there, Through a frosted glass partition, she had a partial view of the main lobby. And she saw them. The trio was no longer in the lobby. They were in a meeting room with glass walls, seated around an oval table, and with them was Dr. Anderson. The same doctor with kind eyes who, a week before, had offered her a path of hope. Seeing him there, conversing calmly with her husband and the others, was like a punch. Amelia shrank behind a large vase of foliage, her heart pulsing in her ears. The meeting room door was ajar, and fragments of the conversation floated to her, loose words and incomplete sentences that didn't form a clear picture, but painted disturbing outlines. "The contract is very clear about confidentiality," said Thomas's calm voice. Contract? The word echoed in Amelia's mind. What kind of agreement would require a contract in a fertility clinic involving those three people? Arthur's voice came next, lower, tense. "Absolutely no one. It's the main condition. For everyone's sake. For everyone's sake. Except hers, apparently." The pain returned, sharp. She was the no one he referred to. Then Thomas's voice, Ava's husband, cut through the air again. There was a contained emotion in his tone, a vulnerability that contrasted with his robust appearance. "Grateful. More than words can say, Arthur. You're giving us—" The sentence trailed off, but the meaning hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Amelia watched the gestures. Arthur seemed tense, almost uncomfortable. Ava kept a protective hand on her belly, her gaze alternating between her husband and her ex-husband. But it was Thomas who intrigued her the most. He looked at Ava's belly with adoration, a reverence that was almost painful to see. It was the look of an expectant father. Amelia's head was boiling. The puzzle pieces were all on the table, but from different games. Nothing fit. A contract. Confidentiality. Thomas's gratitude toward Arthur. Ava's pregnancy. Their presence at the clinic. It was a tangle of secrets that excluded her deliberately and cruelly. The distrust was a poison spreading through her veins. Every exchanged glance between them, every unspoken word, seemed like a conspiracy against her. The pain was no longer just from romantic betrayal. It was the pain of being deceived, of being treated as an irrelevant piece in their life game. She didn't understand what was happening, but she understood perfectly the result. She was on the outside, looking in, and the truth they protected so zealously was, in some way, about her too. And the certainty that there was something much bigger and more devastating involved solidified in her chest like a block of ice. Amelia's world had shrunk to that dimly lit hallway, and the fragments of conversation escaping through the ajar door. Each word was a new knot in her throat, each glance she spied a new stab in her chest. She was so absorbed in her vigil, so immersed in trying to decipher that enigma, that she didn't notice the approach of soft footsteps on the carpet. "Ma'am? Excuse me, you can't be here." The voice, professional but firm, startled her. Amelia turned abruptly and came face to face with a young nurse, her uniform impeccable, contrasting with the chaos that had settled inside her. The employee's gaze was suspicious, caught in the act like a criminal. The humiliation was the last straw, the spark that ignited the powder keg of her pent-up emotions. All the pain, rage, confusion, and anguish of the last week exploded in a single uncontrollable impulse. Prudence shattered. The plan to investigate in secret fell apart. In that moment, there was only one thing to do. With her face burning and her heart hammering against her ribs, Amelia ignored the nurse, took 2 firm steps and pushed the meeting room door with all her strength. The door opened with a dull thud, and 4 pairs of eyes turned to her in unison. The silence in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Dr. Anderson stared at her with professional astonishment. Thomas, with pure confusion. Ava, with a horror that mirrored on her pale face. But it was Arthur's gaze that pierced her. In it, there was devastating panic, the expression of a man whose deepest secret had just been exposed in the most brutal way possible. "Amelia," he whispered, her name leaving his lips as if it were a ghost. "What does this mean, Arthur?" Her voice came out trembling, but loaded with a fury she didn't know she possessed. She took a step into the room, her gaze sweeping each of their faces. "A contract? Confidentiality? What the hell is going on here?" Arthur stood up in a leap, his hands raised in a gesture of appeasement. "Amelia, calm down. I can explain. It's not what you're thinking." "It's not what I'm thinking," she laughed, a dry sound without joy. "And what exactly should I think? I see my husband in a fertility clinic with his pregnant ex-wife and her current husband, and all of you acting like you're in a business meeting. What explanation is there for this, Arthur? That you decided to have a child with her and conveniently forgot to tell me." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. The pain on Arthur's face deepened. No, of course not. Never. It was Ava who intervened. She stood up with difficulty, her hand still on her belly, her face marked by genuine anguish. She looked at the suffering etched on every line of Amelia's face, and an expression of deep empathy seemed to overcome her own panic. "Arthur, stop," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let me talk to her. Alone." Thomas and Arthur looked at her, hesitant. "Ava, are you sure?" asked Thomas, the concern evident in his voice. "I am," she replied, without taking her eyes off Amelia. "She deserves the truth, and she needs to hear it from me." Reluctantly, Arthur, Thomas, and a visibly uncomfortable Dr. Anderson left the room, closing the door behind them and leaving the two women alone in the tense silence. "Amelia, I know nothing I say now will take away your pain," Ava began, her voice low. "But you need to understand. This isn't about Arthur and me. It never was." She took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to reveal a painful secret. "My husband, Thomas, he's a wonderful man. His lifelong dream has always been to be a father. We tried for years, went through every treatment you can imagine." She paused, and her eyes filled with tears. "We found out he's sterile. The news devastated him. It destroyed a part of him." Amelia listened, her heart still beating hard, the rage beginning to be eroded by a strange and unexpected pang of recognition, the pain of infertility. She knew it all too well. "I wanted to give him that dream," Ava continued, her voice choked. "But I also wanted our child to have a part of me biologically. That's when I had the idea, the only idea that seemed possible." She looked directly at Amelia. "I approached Arthur. I asked him to be the donor. So the baby would be mine, but Thomas could register it, love it, and raise it as the father he so dreams of being. The official and only father. It had to be with someone I trusted, someone I knew from the compatibility, the past, the genes, anyway." The revelation fell on Amelia with the weight of an avalanche. Donor, not lover, not a second father. A biological means to a desperate end. "Everything was done legally," Ava hurried to explain, as if anticipating the next question. "With lawyers, an absolute confidentiality contract. Arthur will have no paternal rights or duties. He agreed to do this for Thomas, for our pain." Amelia's head spun. The truth was so much more complex, so much sadder than the betrayal she had imagined. "Why didn't he tell me?" Amelia whispered, the question that mattered most. Ava sighed, a sound laden with regret. "He wanted to. God, how he wanted to. He told me he hated keeping a secret from you, but it was Thomas's request. He's so fragile with all this. The idea of anyone else knowing, the fear that the story might leak in the future and the child find out the truth in the wrong way. He insisted on telling you. He said he trusted you and your total confidentiality, but Thomas really didn't want to. Arthur was protecting Thomas's secret, not his own." Ava's words hung in the air, filling the silence of the meeting room. The truth, finally revealed, didn't bring the relief one might expect. Instead, it lodged in Amelia's chest like a complex and multifaceted weight. The fury that had propelled her into that room dissipated, leaving behind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The tears that came this time weren't of rage, but of a deep and overwhelming sadness. She cried. She cried for the secret, for the lie by omission that made her feel like a fool, a stranger in her own husband's life. The feeling of betrayal was still there, an open wound, because trust once broken doesn't regenerate easily. He had made a choice, a pact, and excluded her from it. But through her tears, she looked at Ava and saw not a rival, but a reflection of her own pain, her own longings, the desperate desire to have a child, the soul-corroding pain of infertility, the feeling of inadequacy. She knew every one of those shadows. And thinking of Thomas, a man she barely knew but whose pain was now palpable, her heart contracted in unexpected empathy. The dream of being a father, frustrated by biology, the desire to protect his family and the future child from stigma. How could she judge their desperation when she herself was willing to do anything to achieve the same dream? "I understand," Amelia whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, the words surprising even herself. "I understand why." Ava took a step forward and, hesitating for an instant, placed her hand on Amelia's arm. The touch was light, a plea for peace. "I'm so sorry, Amelia. Truly. The last thing I wanted was to cause this pain to you." When the door opened again, Arthur entered first, his face a mask of anxiety. Seeing Amelia crying, but no longer with the previous fury, he seemed to crumble. "My love, forgive me," he said, his voice choked. "I swear I wanted to tell you every day. Every time I looked at you, at our struggle, this secret consumed me, but I gave my word. The contract, Thomas's condition, I was trapped." He tried to approach, but Amelia recoiled instinctively. Understanding wasn't synonymous with forgiveness. Not yet. "I need some time, Arthur," she said, her voice firmer now. "I need to think." The drive back home was in sepulchral silence. Arthur drove, casting pleading glances at her, trying to start a conversation, explain himself again. He repeated that he wouldn't have paternity, that it was just an act of help, that the contract exempted him from everything. But Amelia couldn't hear. His words were just white noise against the deafening roar of her own thoughts. She understood the logic of the situation, the twisted nobility of his act. But the heart doesn't operate on logic. The heart felt the wound of the secret, the loneliness of her own battle, while he participated in another, even if altruistically. He was creating a life even for others, while she cried over negative tests. The irony was too cruel. Upon arriving home, the familiar environment seemed strange, hostile. Amelia went straight to the bedroom and began packing a small suitcase. Clothes, toiletries, the essentials. "What are you doing?" Arthur asked, standing in the doorway, his voice laden with panic. "I'm going to my parents' house." "For a few days," she replied, without looking him in the eyes. I can't stay here right now. Amelia, please don't do this. Let's talk. We can get through this together." "Like we get through everything together, Arthur?" She finally looked at him, and the hurt overflowed in her voice. "I was alone in my pain, alone going to a clinic for the first time, full of fear and hope hidden from you, while you were already there, keeping a secret that involved me in the most intimate way possible. I need space. I need to breathe." He didn't argue anymore. The truth in her words silenced him. He just stood there watching her close the suitcase, the picture of defeat. At her parents' house, she was received with worried hugs, but without questions. They saw her state and knew she needed a refuge, not an interrogation. In the quiet of her old childhood bedroom, surrounded by relics of a simpler life, Amelia finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the decision she needed to make. She accepted the explanation, but could she accept the reality? Could she look at her husband the same way? Could she forgive the secret? Her heart, tight and confused, had no answers, only the certainty that, for now, the distance was the only thing keeping her from drowning. The days at her parents' house dragged on in a haze of melancholy. Amelia spent the hours in the backyard garden, sitting on the same wooden swing where she had spent so many afternoons as a teenager. The back-and-forth motion was a pendulum measuring her internal conflict. Her rational mind accepted Arthur's explanation, but her heart remained wounded, sensitive to the touch of the memory of the secret. His messages and calls were constant, full of pleas for forgiveness and promises to regain her trust. She read them, listened to the voicemails, but didn't respond. She needed that silence to find herself. It was on the third day of her self-imposed exile that she began to feel strange. A wave of nausea surprised her in the morning, something she attributed to stress and sleepless nights. Then came an overwhelming fatigue, a weariness that weighed on her bones and made her crave bed in broad daylight. Her breasts were sore, and discomfort she ignored as a premenstrual symptom. However, on the 5th day, while having breakfast, the strong smell of the coffee her mother was brewing, an aroma she always loved, turned her stomach violently. She ran to the bathroom, the nausea rising uncontrollably. Leaning on the sink, panting, she looked at herself in the mirror. And then a thought, timid and almost absurd, began to form. Her cycle was late. With all the emotional chaos, she hadn't even realized. A spark of a possibility so remote she barely dared to name it ignited in her chest. She remembered the hormonal treatment she had done months before, the one that hadn't resulted in anything, and that she had abandoned, disillusioned, shortly before deciding to seek out the New Horizons clinic. The doctors had said that sometimes the body took time to respond. Could it be possible? With her heart racing from a mix of fear and fragile hope, she asked her mother to go to the pharmacy. She didn't give details, just asked for a favor. When her mother returned with the small box, Amelia felt the same familiar dread that had accompanied her for years. She locked herself in the bathroom, her hands shaking so much she could barely open the packaging. This time, the wait for the minutes was a different agony. There wasn't the anxiety of expectation, but the fear of another disappointment at a time when she already felt completely shattered. She left the test on the sink and turned away, unable to look. She breathed deeply, counted to 10, and finally forced herself to face the small plastic display. 2 lines, not 1. 2. Clear, unequivocal, vibrant, positive. The air escaped her lungs in a sob. The tears came instantly, but they weren't the tears of pain or hurt that had been her constant companions. They were tears of shock, disbelief, of a joy so pure and overwhelming it seemed capable of healing all wounds. She was pregnant, after all the years, all the pain, all the struggle. The miracle she had prayed for, the answer she had sought so desperately, had arrived. Silently, without her noticing, life had found a way. The news changed everything. The fog of resentment that enveloped her began to dissipate, replaced by the blinding light of that new reality. For the first time in a long time, she felt true hope, a joy that was hers alone, born from her own body. In that same instant, she knew what she needed to do. She picked up the phone and, with fingers still trembling, dialed Arthur's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense. "Amelia?" "Arthur," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm coming home for dinner tonight. I need to talk to you." There was a silence on the other end, a silence of pure surprise. Of course, whatever time you want." That night, Amelia prepared his favorite dish. The house, which had seemed so cold before, was now warmed by the aroma of the food and the flame of her new hope. When Arthur arrived, he looked at her with fearful caution, as if treading on fragile ground. She gave him a genuine smile, the first in over a week. During dinner they talked little, but the silence was no longer of hurt, but of expectant peace. After dessert, Amelia took a deep breath. "Arthur, I know the last weeks have been difficult," she began. "And we still have a lot to talk about, but something happened, something that changes everything." She stood up, went to her purse, and took out the small white box of the pregnancy test. She walked to him and placed it on the table in front of his plate. Arthur looked at the box, then at her, confusion on his face. He picked it up, opened it, and took out the small plastic object with the 2 red lines. He looked at the test, then at Amelia's face, his eyes widening in disbelief. This is," he stammered, unable to form the sentence. Amelia just nodded, tears of happiness streaming freely down her face. "We did it, Art. We're going to have a baby." Arthur's face fell apart. The pain, guilt, and anxiety he had carried for so long gave way to an explosion of pure emotion. He stood up, went around the table, and enveloped her in his arms, lifting her off the ground. He hugged her with the strength of years of waiting and frustrations, his face buried in her neck, sobs of joy shaking his body. In that embrace, the last shadows of the secret and pain dissolved. There, in the living room of their home, there was no longer the ex-wife, the contract, or the perceived betrayal. There were just the 2 of them, a couple who had crossed hell, and on the other side found not only forgiveness, but the miracle they had always dreamed of. The journey had been tortuous and full of pain, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. Together, on the threshold of their own long-awaited happy ending. Did you enjoy this emotional story full of twists, secrets, and miracles? Love and hope always find a way, even on the toughest journeys. Leave your comment below about what you thought happened, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our next stories made especially for you. Your participation is our greatest gift. Thank you so much, and see you in the next video.